England, 1862, Victorian era. The crystal chandeliers of Ashford Estate's grand ballroom cast their amber glow over a sea of pastel silks and black evening coats below. Near the terrace doors, partially obscured by a towering arrangement of white roses, stood Miss Almira Hawthorne, her 45 years settling upon her like an invisible weight as she watched the younger couples glide across the polished floor. "Can you imagine?" whispered Lady Harrowby behind her ivory fan to the Dowager Countess beside her. "Miss Hawthorne has attended yet another season. One would think after 25 years of failure, she might accept her fate with some grace and retire to the country." The words, though spoken in hushed tones, carried to Almira's ears like daggers finding flesh. She lifted her chin, smoothed the crimson silk of her gown, a bold color that the matrons had clucked over as inappropriate for a woman of her station and years, and pretended not to have heard. At 45, Almira had long since grown accustomed to such barbs. The spinster of the respectable Hawthorne family, she had watched as her younger sister married a baronet, as her peers built nurseries and established households, as the society that had once welcomed her as a promising debutante now regarded her with a potent mixture of pity and barely concealed mockery. "Miss Hawthorne," came a concerned voice at her elbow. It was her sister, Beatrice, now Lady Windermere. "You look rather pale. Shall I have a carriage brought round?" "Thank you, Beatrice, but I am quite well," she replied with a practiced smile that had taken decades to perfect. "I was merely admiring Lady Ashford's choice of orchestra. The waltz is particularly well executed this evening." Beatrice's expression softened with the sort of concern reserved for invalids and the pitiable. "Almira, you need not subject yourself to every social gathering. No one would fault you if I were to withdraw from society altogether." Almira finished for her, a rare flash of steel entering her usually measured voice. "If I became the reclusive maiden aunt, appearing only for christenings and reading lessons in the nursery? No, sister. I may not have secured a husband, but I refuse to simply disappear." Before Beatrice could respond, a collective hush fell over the ballroom. Even the skilled orchestra faltered mid-phrase, instruments trailing into an uncertain silence. "His Grace, the Duke of Blackwood," announced the butler at the grand entrance, his voice carrying the weight of ceremony. Duke Thaddeus Blackwood stood framed in the gilded doorway, tall and severe in his impeccable evening attire, his dark hair swept back from a face of sharp angles and aristocratic hauteur that society pages had once compared to a Renaissance prince. At 43, he had remained England's most eligible bachelor and, by reputation, its most unapproachable. The ballroom seemed to hold its breath. Every ambitious mamma straightened. Every unmarried daughter cast down her eyes in affected modesty, while ensuring their best profile was displayed. Almira, who had long ago learned not to hope, simply observed with the detached interest of one watching a familiar play. The Duke's dark eyes swept the ballroom with the enthusiasm of a man surveying a particularly tedious obligation. His expression remained carefully neutral, his posture rigid as he descended the shallow steps into the assembly. Then, impossibly, his gaze found Almira. For a heartbeat, perhaps two, their eyes met across the expanse of polished marble and swirling couples. Something flickered in the Duke's expression, too quick to name, before his features returned to their customary mask of aristocratic indifference. Almira's breath caught. She told herself it meant nothing. She had learned long ago not to mistake a passing glance for interest, not to construct castles from the sand of momentary attention. But then the Duke began to move, not toward the cluster of young debutantes who had positioned themselves in his path, not toward Lord Ashford and the other gentlemen gathering near the card-room. He walked directly, deliberately toward the terrace doors, toward her. The whispers began immediately, rippling through the crowd like wind across wheat. Lady Pemberton's fan snapped open. Beatrice grasped Almira's arm, her fingers tight with shock or warning. The Duke stopped before her, and suddenly Almira was aware of everything. The crimson of her gown that had seemed defiant an hour ago now felt garish. The golden threads in her hair that she refused to hide with dyes suddenly seemed like a proclamation of her age. The eyes of 300 members of the ton boring into her back like so many physical weights. "Miss Hawthorne," the Duke said, his voice carrying in the unnatural silence that had fallen over the ballroom. For one impossible moment, hope unfurled in Almira's chest, fragile, dangerous, unwanted. After 25 years of rejection, she had thought herself beyond such foolishness. Yet here it was, that treacherous flutter of possibility. The Duke's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Then he spoke, each word falling with the finality of a judge's gavel. "I'm afraid you misunderstand. A dance between us would be inappropriate." The collective gasp was audible. Someone's champagne glass shattered on the marble floor. Lady Harrowby's fan fell from her suddenly limp fingers. The young Miss Delaney actually giggled behind her gloved hand before her mother silenced her with a sharp look. Almira stood frozen, her face a careful mask even as something vital cracked inside her chest. She had endured 2 decades of social cruelty, the pitying smiles, the cutting remarks, the gradual transformation from person to cautionary tale. But this public humiliation was delivered by the man who had walked past every eligible woman in England to reject her specifically, loudly, before the witness. "Of course, Your Grace," she heard herself say, her voice steady through sheer force of will cultivated over a lifetime of maintaining dignity in the face of dismissal. "I apologize for any misunderstanding." The Duke's expression remained impassive, though something flickered in his dark eyes. Was it regret? Almira could not tell, would not allow herself to speculate. He bowed stiffly, the gesture perfectly correct and utterly cold, then turned and walked away. The ballroom erupted. Whispers became murmurs, became open speculation. Beatrice was speaking urgently in her ear about leaving immediately, about the carriage, about saving what little dignity remained. But Almira barely heard her. She stood in her crimson gown, bold, defiant, utterly foolish crimson, and felt the weight of 45 years of rejection crystallize into this single, devastating moment. She had survived 25 seasons of disappointment. She had maintained grace through countless small cruelties. But as she watched Duke Thaddeus Blackwood disappear into the card room without a backward glance, Miss Almira Hawthorne discovered that even the strongest armor, forged over decades of social warfare, could finally, irrevocably break. What she did not see, what no one saw, was the Duke's hand trembling as he accepted a brandy from a startled footman. She did not see him retreat to the darkened library, where he stood alone in the shadows, staring at nothing. And she certainly did not see him withdraw a small object from his inner pocket, a miniature portrait of a woman in a crimson gown, her golden hair catching the light, her eyes filled with the quiet strength of someone who had learned to survive the world's cruelty. She did not see him whisper into the darkness, his voice rough with an emotion that would have shocked every soul in that glittering ballroom. "Forgive me!" The carriage ride back to Hawthorne House passed in merciful silence. Beatrice had learned long ago when her sister required words, and when she required their absence. Tonight, as Almira sat rigidly against the velvet cushions, her crimson gown now seeming to mock her with its boldness, silence was the only kindness available. By morning, all of London would know. The spinster Hawthorne, already a figure of pity and whispered amusement, had been publicly rejected by the Duke of Blackwood himself. She could already hear the drawing-room conversations, the carefully modulated voices dripping with false sympathy. "My dear, did you hear about poor Miss Hawthorne? The Duke actually told her a dance would be inappropriate. How absolutely mortifying. We should leave for the countryside," Beatrice said as soon as they entered the foyer of Hawthorne House, finally breaking her silence. "Tomorrow. We can say you've taken ill. By the time we return for the autumn season, this will have blown over. Run away, you mean?" Almira removed her gloves with deliberate care, refusing to let her hands tremble. "Hide until society finds some other unfortunate soul to mock." "Almira, please. There's no shame in—" "In what? In admitting defeat?" Almira turned to face her sister, and Beatrice actually flinched at the steel in her eyes. "I have attended this season for 25 years, Beatrice. I have endured whispers and pity and the gradual transformation from person to cautionary tale. I will not run now." She climbed the stairs to her chambers, each step requiring more strength than the last. Only when her door closed behind her did she allow the mask to slip, sinking onto the edge of her bed as the weight of the evening finally crashed over her. Hours later, long after the house had fallen into darkness, her lady's maid brought the evening's correspondence on a silver tray. One letter lay apart from the others, sealed with plain black wax bearing no crest. Almira's hand shook as she broke the seal. The handwriting was elegant, masculine, utterly unfamiliar. "His cruelty was kindness. You are in danger. Trust nothing you see." No signature. No explanation. Just those 9 words that made the world tilt on its axis. Across London, in the shadows of his private study at Blackwood House, Duke Thaddeus Blackwood stood motionless before his desk. The brandy in his glass had long since grown warm, untouched. On the other hand, he held a miniature portrait no larger than his palm, painted 3 months ago by an artist sworn to secrecy. Almira Hawthorne gazed back at him from the small oval frame, captured in that moment at Lady Ashford's literary salon, when she passionately defended a poem most had dismissed. The artist had caught the intelligence in her eyes, the strength in the set of her jaw, the quiet beauty that society refused to see because it came wrapped in 45 years instead of 20. "Forgive me," he whispered again into the darkness, though she could not hear him. "God forgive me for what I must do to keep you alive." In the corner of his study, concealed behind a panel in the mahogany shelving, lay a collection of documents that would damn his own blood. Evidence carefully gathered over months. Proof of a conspiracy that had already claimed 3 innocent women. And now, by tomorrow's dawn, all of London would believe he had rejected Almira Hawthorne out of cruelty or caprice. No one would suspect the truth, that his coldness was a shield, his rejection a desperate gambit, that he was already, hopelessly, in love with her. The Countess of Fairfax arrived at Hawthorne House 3 days after the disaster at Ashford Estate, sweeping past the butler with the authority of a woman who had known Almira since they were girls at Miss Pemberton's academy. She found Almira in the morning room, surrounded by declined invitations and letters of false sympathy. "Put those dreadful things away," Charlotte commanded, settling onto the settee with a rustle of black silk. Even 5 years widowed, she wore mourning like armor. "We need to talk, and you need to listen without interrupting." Almira set down a particularly insincere note from Lady Harrowby. "If you come to suggest I flee to the countryside, I've come to tell you about the other women." Charlotte's blue eyes were grave. "The ones who came before you." The room suddenly felt colder. Almira's hand stilled in her lap. 15 years ago, Lady Genevieve Ashton was the toast of the season. Beautiful, accomplished, and the Duke danced with her 3 times at the Marlborough Ball. Charlotte leaned forward. Within a week, letters appeared, forged letters suggesting an illicit affair with her father's secretary. Her reputation was destroyed. She fled to Boston and never returned. "Charlotte, what does this?" "I said don't interrupt." The Countess's voice sharpened. 8 years ago, Miss Harriet Cromwell caught the Duke's attention at the Royal Academy. They were seen in conversation on 4 separate occasions. Then she fell mysteriously ill. The physicians couldn't explain it. Fever, delirium, complete collapse. She barely survived. The moment she recovered, she entered a French convent. Almira's throat tightened. The cryptic letter upstairs suddenly burned in her memory. "You are in danger." "And Lady Arabella Worth?" Charlotte's voice dropped to barely a whisper. 5 years ago, the Duke was finally ready to propose. Everyone knew it. The announcement was expected any day. She paused, her composure cracking. "Arabella was my cousin, Almira. Her horse threw her during a morning ride. Broke her neck. The day before he was to ask her father's permission." The silence stretched between them, heavy with implication. "The groom who saddled her horse disappeared that same day," Charlotte continued. "Never found. And I have always wondered, always, why a perfectly trained mare would suddenly bolt on familiar ground. Almira rose and walked to the window, her mind racing. 3 women. 3 disasters. All connected to Duke Thaddeus Blackwood. You think someone is deliberately... I think, Charlotte interrupted, joining her at the window, that sometimes rejection is not cruelty but protection. I think your public humiliation, as devastating as it was, may have saved your life. Almira's hand went to her throat, feeling her pulse beneath her fingers. The Duke's face flashed through her memory, not the cold mask he'd worn at the ball, but that fleeting moment when their eyes had met. The flicker of something that might have been anguish. His cruelty was kindness. But why would anyone? That, Charlotte said grimly, is the question that's haunted me for 5 years. Someone in the Duke's orbit doesn't want him to marry. Someone with access, with resources, with enough hatred or greed to kill for it. She gripped Almira's hand. And now you need to decide. Do you accept his rejection and remain safe? Or do you dig for the truth and risk becoming the 4th name on that terrible list? Almira looked down at their joined hands, then out at the London street beyond. Somewhere in this city, the Duke carried his secrets. And somewhere, a murderer waited in the shadows. I need to know the truth, she whispered. The Huntington Garden Party had been designed to showcase the estate's famous hedge maze. Its 12-foot walls of meticulously trimmed promising mystery and romance under the light of 1,000 lanterns. Almira had no interest in either. She sought only escape from the pitying glances and carefully neutral greetings that had followed her for the past week. She slipped into the maze's entrance as the orchestra struck up a waltz, the music fading behind the dense walls of greenery. The lantern light barely penetrated here, casting everything in amber shadow. Her footsteps whispered against the gravel path as she turned left, then right, then left again, not caring about finding the center, only wanting to be lost. Miss Hawthorne. The voice came from the shadows, and Almira's heart lurched. She spun to find Duke Thaddeus Blackwood emerging from a side passage, his evening coat abandoned, his cravat loosened as though he'd been running. In the dim lantern light, his face was transformed. Gone was the aristocratic mask. What remained was something raw and desperate. Your Grace. She forced her voice to remain steady even as her pulse thundered. If you've come to deliver further humiliation, I've come to beg you. He moved closer, and she saw his hands were trembling. Please, Miss Hawthorne, remain unremarkable. Accept no invitations from my family. Attend fewer events. Make yourself invisible in society's eyes. Invisible? The word came out sharp with bitter laughter. I assure you, after your performance at Ashford Estate, I am already quite invisible. Or have you forgotten? I have forgotten nothing. His voice cracked, and suddenly he was closer still, close enough that she could see the shadows beneath his eyes, the tension in his jaw. Not the way you defended Wordsworth at Lady Ashford's salon when everyone else dismissed him as passé. Not how you corrected Lord Harrowby's misattribution of that Turner piece without making him feel the fool. Not the exact shade of your eyes when you laugh, which is not often enough. Almira's breath caught. Then why? I cannot explain. He looked away, his profile sharp in the amber light. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. But you must trust me when I tell you that my coldness is the greatest kindness I can offer. That makes no sense. Frustration overrode caution, and she grasped his arm. The Countess told me about the others. Genevieve Ashton, Harriet Cromwell, Arabella Worth. What happened to them? His whole body went rigid. When he turned back to her, the raw emotion in his dark eyes made her stomach drop. They made the mistake of being seen with me, of mattering to me. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. And someone made them pay for it. Who? Why won't you? Because I would rather endure your hatred than attend your funeral. The words hung between them like a physical thing. Before she could respond, before she could process what he just admitted, he stepped back into the shadows. Please, he said, his voice breaking. Stay away from me. Stay safe. Then he was gone, disappearing into the maze's dark passages, as though he'd never been there at all. Almira stood alone in the amber light, one hand pressed to her racing heart. Charlotte was right. The rejection had been protection. But protection from what? From whom? And why did the Duke look at her, as though she were simultaneously his salvation and his damnation? For the first time in 25 years of disappointment, Almira Hawthorne felt something dangerous unfurl in her chest. Not the fragile hope of being chosen, but something fiercer. The determination to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The first poem arrived the morning after the maze, delivered with the regular post as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world. Almira's maid brought it with breakfast. A single sheet of ivory paper folded and sealed with black wax bearing no discernible crest, just the impression of the grain. She broke the seal with trembling fingers. They see the years upon your face, and count them as a failing grace. But I have learned what fools dismiss, that wisdom earned is worth far more than youth's brief kiss. The handwriting was elegant, masculine, and deliberate. Each letter formed with the careful attention of someone who understood that words were precious things. Almira read it 3 times before pressing it to her chest, her eyes burning with unshed tears. Someone saw her. Not the spinster, not the cautionary tale, but her. The second poem came 2 days later. Then a third. Then a fourth. Each one demonstrated an intimate knowledge of her private world, her love of Coleridge's mysticism, her secret preference for Byron despite his scandalous reputation, her belief that Shelley understood the human heart better than any philosopher. You quote Wordsworth to make them comfortable, but late at night you read Byron's Fire. You hide your brilliant, hungry soul behind polite smiles and appropriate attire. How could anyone know? These were thoughts she'd shared with no one, dreams she'd buried beneath 25 years of society's expectations. She carried the latest poem to Lucky's Books on a gray Thursday afternoon, the small shop tucked into a narrow street where ladies of quality rarely ventured alone. Mr. Lucky, a scholarly man of 60 with ink-stained fingers and kind eyes, had been supplying her with books since she was 16. Interesting, he murmured, examining the paper against his window's light. "This is Thornbury and Son stock. They're stationers to the royal household and the highest nobility. Very exclusive. They keep meticulous records of their clients. Could you discover who purchases this particular weight and color?" His eyes twinkled behind his spectacles. "My dear Miss Hawthorne, I've known you long enough to recognize when you're investigating something. What has captured your formidable mind?" "A mystery," she admitted. "One that may be dangerous. Then I shall be discreet." He folded the paper carefully. "Give me 3 days." Almira returned home to find another poem waiting. This one made her breath stop entirely. "I watch you across crowded rooms, pretending coldness, feigning first, while my heart screams what I cannot speak. That loving you may be what saves me, or what sees us both lost." The seal pressed into the black wax was clearer this time. She held it close to the lamp and traced the pattern with one finger. Wood grain. Blackwood. Blackwood. Her hand shook as she pressed the paper to her lips. The Duke was sending her poetry. The same man who'd publicly rejected her, who'd begged her to remain invisible, who'd looked at her in the maze with desperate, dangerous eyes. He was courting her in secret, wooing her with words, while the world believed he dismissed her as beneath his notice. But why? What enemy lurked in the shadows that made a public courtship impossible? And how long could love survive when it could only exist in stolen verses and midnight confessions? Almira locked the poems in her writing desk and made a decision. If the Duke wouldn't give her answers, she would find them herself, starting with the 3 women who'd come before her. Someone had destroyed them. Someone who moved in the Duke's orbit, who had the resources and ruthlessness to commit murder. And Almira Hawthorne was going to discover who. The Royal Opera House blazed with light and ambition. 5 tiers of boxes filled with England's most powerful families positioned to see and be seen. Almira had accepted Charlotte's invitation reluctantly, knowing she would be scrutinized, discussed, dissected by the very people who'd witnessed her humiliation at Ashford Estate. She dressed carefully in deep emerald silk that made her feel armored, her golden hair swept into an elegant chignon. If society was determined to watch her, she would give them someone worth watching. "I'd like to introduce you to someone," Charlotte murmured during the interval, gesturing to a woman approaching their box. "Lady Cordelia Blackwood." Almira's breath caught. The Duke's cousin. The woman who lived at Blackwood Manor with her son, who had access to the Duke's household, his correspondence, his life. Lady Cordelia was breathtaking, perhaps 40, with dark hair, porcelain skin, and the kind of beauty that commanded rooms. Her smile was warm as she extended her hand. "Miss Hawthorne, I've heard so much about you." Her voice was honey and silk. "My cousin speaks of you often." Almira's heart stuttered. "Does he?" "Oh, yes. He was quite affected by your encounter at the Ashford ball." Cordelia's smile never wavered, but something flickered in her pale blue eyes. "Though I'm sure it was all a terrible misunderstanding. Thaddeus can be so awkward in social situations." "How kind of you to say," Almira managed, though every instinct screamed that this woman was dangerous. "You know, I've always imagined Edmund as the next Duke of Blackwood." Cordelia's tone remained pleasant, conversational. "He's 17 now, such a brilliant boy. His father was Thaddeus's uncle, you see, so if anything were to happen—" She trailed off delicately, her smile widening. "But of course, nothing will. The Blackwood line has been remarkably fortunate, despite the occasional tragic accident." The blood drained from Almira's face. Tragic accident. The exact words that had described Arabella Worth's death. "How reassuring!" Charlotte interjected coolly, her hand finding Almira's beneath their shawls and squeezing tight. "Indeed." Cordelia's gaze drifted across the theater, then sharpened. "Ah, speak of the devil." The Duke had just entered his private box across the horseshoe of the theater. Even at this distance, Almira could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his dark eyes swept the crowd with something like dread. Then his gaze found hers. Time seemed to suspend. The opera house, with its hundreds of spectators and glittering chandeliers, faded to nothing. There was only the Duke's face, the naked longing in his expression before he could mask it, the way his hand gripped the edge of his box as though he might vault across the theater itself. Almira's breath caught. In that unguarded moment, she saw everything, the poems, the maze, the desperate warning. She saw a man in love, and was terrified of what that love might cost. Beside her, Lady Cordelia made a small sound, something between a gasp and a hiss. Almira turned just in time to see the transformation. Cordelia's beautiful face contorted with such pure, venomous hatred that Almira actually recoiled. It lasted only a heartbeat before the pleasant mask snapped back into place. But Almira had seen. She'd seen the monster beneath the smile. "How lovely to meet you, Miss Hawthorne," Cordelia said, her voice still honey-sweet even as her eyes promised murder. "I do hope we'll become better acquainted. After all, I consider it my duty to know everyone in my dear cousin's orbit." She glided away, leaving Almira shaking. "That," Charlotte whispered, "is your enemy." Almira watched Cordelia disappear into the crowd, watched the Duke across the theater fighting to look anywhere but at her, and understood with crystalline clarity. Lady Cordelia Blackwood had destroyed 3 women to keep her son as the Duke's heir. And she would kill again to stop a 4th. Almira's brother arrived at Hawthorne House on a rain-soaked Tuesday evening, unannounced and accompanied by an unexpected guest. She found them waiting in her father's old study, Captain James Hawthorne still in his military greatcoat, and the Duke of Blackwood standing by the window like a man preparing for execution. "Jamie?" Almira's voice caught. Her brother had been in Portsmouth for months, investigating naval supply irregularities. "What are you doing here?" "His Grace requested my assistance." James's withered face was grim. "Sit down, Mira. What we have to show you is not easy." The Duke turned from the window, and Almira saw he looked haggard, as though he hadn't slept in days. Their eyes met, and she saw everything there: apology, anguish, desperate hope. James spread documents across the desk with military precision. 15 years ago, A series of forged letters destroyed Lady Genevieve Ashton's reputation. The paper was traced to a stationer in Cheapside that keeps no client records. But a shopkeeper 3 doors down remembered a lady in black, widowed, beautiful, who paid a street urchin to make the purchase. He laid out the letters, crude forgeries now that Almira examined them closely. The handwriting trying too hard to appear masculine, the ink common rather than the quality a secretary would use. 8 years ago, Miss Harriet Cromwell received a tonic for her nerves from an anonymous benefactor. James produced a small brown bottle. The physician who treated her kept a sample. We had it analyzed. Arsenic. Carefully measured doses that would mimic natural illness. Almira's stomach turned. Dear God! And 5 years ago, the Duke spoke for the first time, his voice rough with barely contained emotion. A groom named Thomas Blackwell was paid £50 to loosen Lady Arabella's saddle girth. He disappeared the next day, fleeing to Ireland. He pulled out a worn letter, the paper stained and creased. Before he died last year, he confessed to a priest. The priest contacted me 6 months ago. The letter trembled in Almira's hands as she read the groom's guilt-stricken confession, his description of the lady who'd approached him in a tavern, beautiful, dark-haired, speaking of preserving the natural order. All 3 trails, James said quietly, lead to Lady Cordelia Blackwood. Almira looked up at the Duke, understanding crashing over her. The rejection at Ashford Estate was theater. He moved closer, his hands clenched at his sides, as though fighting the urge to reach for her. Cordelia watches me constantly. Any woman I show genuine interest in becomes a target. I've spent 15 years avoiding entanglements, refusing to endanger anyone else after Arabella. His voice cracked. Then I met you at Lady Ashford's salon, and you defended that terrible Wordsworth interpretation with such passion that I forgot every vow I'd made to myself. So you rejected me publicly to keep you off her list while we gathered proof. James indicated the documents. His Grace came to me 3 months ago. We've been building a case that will stand up in any court in England. 3 months? Almira's mind reeled. The poems, the maze, all of it while he'd been investigating a murderer. I've been watching you for longer, the Duke admitted, his dark eyes holding hers. 6 months, if I'm honest. I commissioned that miniature portrait after the Turner exhibition, when you corrected Lord Pemberton so gracefully that he thanked you for it. I knew that I was lost. But why tell me now? Because Cordelia saw me look at you at the opera house. His jaw tightened. She knows. And that means you're in danger whether I stay away from you or not. At least if you know the truth, you can protect yourself. Almira stood, her legs unsteady. The man she'd believed had humiliated her had actually been protecting her, fighting for her, building a case to destroy the woman who'd been murdered for 15 years. What do we do now? She asked. The Duke's expression hardened with determination. We set a trap, and we end this once and for all. They met in Lucky's bookshop on a fog-shrouded Thursday morning, the bell above the door announcing Almira's arrival to a seemingly empty shop. But the Duke emerged from behind the philosophy section, a volume of Kant in his hands, and something achingly tender in his eyes. "You came," he said, as though he doubted. "You asked me to." She moved closer, emboldened by the privacy and the truth that now stood between them. "Though meeting in secret feels rather scandalous for two people who've already been publicly associated." "Associated?" His mouth quirked. "Is that what we're calling my spectacular rudeness?" Their conversations in those stolen hours revealed the man beneath the title. He'd been 28 when Arabella died, young enough to believe he could have prevented it, old enough to blame himself for not seeing the danger sooner. He'd spent 15 years building walls, refusing every matchmaking mama, every batting eyelash, every carefully orchestrated encounter. "I thought I could simply never marry," he admitted during their second dawn walk through Hyde Park, the mist rising off the Serpentine as London still slept. "That I could bear the loneliness if it meant no one else would die." "What changed?" Almira asked, though she suspected she knew. "You defended Byron at Lady Ashford's salon." He smiled at the memory. "Everyone else was discussing Tennyson, safe and respectable Tennyson. But you said Byron understood the human capacity for both darkness and transcendence, that his scandalous life didn't diminish the truth in his words." He stopped walking, turning to face her. "I realized at that moment that I'd been merely existing. And you made me want to live." The coded messages arrived hidden in book deliveries, tucked into sheet music, concealed in Charlotte's correspondence. "The nightingale sings at midnight," meant meet at the bookshop. "Wordsworth disappoints again," meant danger, stay away. They built a language only they understood, a secret world within the world that wanted to keep them apart. He quoted Shelley to her in the rare books room of the British Museum, his voice low as other patrons browsed nearby. "I love thee to the depth and breadth and height my soul can reach." When she corrected him, "That's Elizabeth Barrett Browning, not Shelley." His laugh was genuine, unguarded, the sound of a man remembering joy. "There she is," he murmured. "The brilliant woman hiding behind all those practiced smiles." "I'm 45, she said, testing him, needing to hear how he'd respond. "Society says I'm past my prime, past hope, past everything that matters." He took her hand, uncaring that they stood in a public space where anyone might see. "Society said the earth was flat. Society burned Galileo's books. Society," he said fiercely, "has been wrong about everything that truly matters." His thumb traced circles on her palm. "I don't see your age, Almira. I see courage earned through surviving what would have broken weaker souls. I see intelligence refined by years of observation. I see a woman who became extraordinary not despite the world's cruelty, but because she refused to let it diminish her." In that moment, standing in the hushed sanctuary of collected knowledge, Almira understood what she'd been too afraid to acknowledge. She loved him. Not the Duke with his title and fortune, but Thaddeus, the man who'd sacrificed his own happiness to keep strangers safe, who quoted poetry with the reverence of prayer, who saw her as she'd always longed to be seen. "When this is over," he whispered, "when Cordelia can never hurt anyone again, I'm going to court you properly, in ballrooms and drawing rooms, before all of London. And I'm going to marry you, if you'll have me. When this is over, she promised, ask me again. The invitation arrived on ivory paper bordered in black, formal and imposing. The Duke of Blackwood requests the honor of your presence at a grand ball to be held at Blackwood Manor on the evening of June 23, 1862. The first such gathering in 15 years. London society erupted with speculation. The Duke was finally choosing a bride. The betting books at White's filled with names. Miss Delaney, the season's diamond, was the favorite. Lady Margaret Ashworth ran second. Miss Almira Hawthorne's name didn't appear at all. Exactly as they planned. Cordelia's servants have been asking questions, James reported during a clandestine meeting in Almira's drawing room. She's convinced the Duke has set his sights on Miss Delaney. Our planted rumors have done their work. The Duke stood by the window, tension radiating from every line of his body. The Bow Street runners will be positioned as footmen and grooms. My solicitors will be in the card room, witnesses concealed among legitimate guests. Lady Genevieve arrived from Boston yesterday. Harriet left her convent and is staying at Charlotte's townhouse. And the bait? Almira asked, though she hated the word. Miss Delaney's parents have been informed of the danger. She's agreed to play her part. His jaw tightened. A loose balcony railing on the terrace, clearly tampered with. If Cordelia takes the bait and attempts to stage an accident, we'll have her. The night of the ball, Blackwood Manor blazed with 1,000 candles, its halls filled with the cream of English society. Almira arrived with Charlotte, her gown a subdued lavender that marked her as exactly what society believed, a spinster past her prime, no longer in the running for the Duke's hand. She watched Cordelia work the room like a general commanding troops, her beauty amplified by triumph. She saw the woman's eyes track Miss Delaney's every movement, saw her whisper to a footman Almira didn't recognize. One of Cordelia's own servants, no doubt. The Duke played his part magnificently, dancing twice with Miss Delaney, leading her toward the terrace as planned. Almira's heart raced as they disappeared through the French doors, Cordelia following moments later with predatory grace. James materialized at Almira's elbow. Now! They moved through the crowd, Charlotte creating a distraction by fainting dramatically in the ballroom center. As guests rushed to assist, Almira and James slipped onto the terrace. They found Cordelia frozen beside the balcony railing, her hand still on the loosened bolt, Miss Delaney safe several feet away, with the Duke's protective arm around her. For Bow Street runners emerged from the shadows, their presence unmistakable now. Lady Cordelia Blackwood, the lead runner announced, you are under arrest for the attempted murder of Miss Delaney and suspected in the murders and attempted murders of. You have no proof. Cordelia's voice was venomous, but her face had gone white. On the contrary, the Duke's solicitor stepped forward, flanked by two women Almira recognized from descriptions, Lady Genevieve Ashton and Miss Harriet Cromwell, both returned to testify. We have 15 years of evidence, witnesses, documents, confessions. He held up the groom's letter. And now, attempted murder before a dozen witnesses. Cordelia's beautiful face twisted with rage as she looked at the Duke. This was all for Edmund. He deserves to be Duke. Not some merchant's daughter you might marry, not. Her gaze found Almira in the shadows, and understanding crashed over her features. Her, she hissed. This was all for her. No, the Duke said quietly, moving to stand beside Almira, finally, publicly claiming his place at her side. This was for justice. For Arabella, for Genevieve, for Harriet, for every woman you tried to destroy. As the runners led Cordelia away, her son Edmund stood watching, tears streaming down his face, grief and shame warring on his young features. The trap had worked. But the real revelation was yet to come. The Duke's voice rang through the ballroom with the authority of a man who had carried silence too long. Ladies and gentlemen, I must beg your attention for a matter of grave importance. 300 faces turned toward him, the orchestra falling silent, champagne glasses freezing midway to lips. This was not the usual announcement of an engagement. This was something else entirely. He stood at the top of the grand staircase, documents in hand, and began to speak. 15 years of conspiracy laid bare before the Tun. The forged letters that destroyed Lady Genevieve. The arsenic that nearly killed Harriet Cromwell. The murdered groom's confession. And finally, Lady Arabella Worth's fatal accident was no accident at all. Lady Genevieve stepped forward, her Boston accent barely masking her English roots, and testified through tears. Lady Cordelia destroyed my life because the Duke smiled at me, because I dared to matter to him. Harriet spoke next, her voice steady despite the trembling of her hands. She poisoned me systematically for months. I only survived because I entered the convent, and she could no longer reach me. The ballroom erupted in gasps and whispers. Edmund Blackwood, barely 17, stepped forward with tears streaming down his face. Cousin Thaddeus, I swear to you, I knew nothing. Had I known, I would have stopped her. I would have. His voice broke. I'm so sorry. For all of them. For everything. The Duke's expression softened. I know, Edmund. You are not your mother's sins. As the runners led Cordelia through the crowd toward the entrance, she spat one final venomous truth. It should have been Edmund. He deserved it more than some spinster you felt sorry for. No, the Duke said, his voice carrying across the stunned silence. Not pity. He descended the stairs, his eyes fixed on one woman in the sea of faces. Almira stood frozen, her crimson gown, the same defiant crimson she'd worn at Ashford Estate, marking her like a flame in the crowd. The Duke crossed the ballroom floor, every eye following him, history repeating itself with a completely different ending. He stopped before her, and this time there was no mask, no coldness, no pretense. He dropped to one knee. The collective gasp was audible, but Almira heard nothing except his words. Miss Hawthorne, I have loved you from the moment you defended Byron at Lady Ashford's literary salon with such passion that I forgot every vow I had made to remain alone. I have loved you through every moment of this necessary deception. I rejected you to save your life." His voice cracked with emotion. "Now I'm begging you to save mine. Marry me." The ballroom held its breath. Almira looked down at the most powerful man in England kneeling before her, offering her everything society said she could never have. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, for all of them to hear. "Yes." 3 years later, Duchess Almira Blackwood stood in the private gallery of Blackwood Manor, age 48, studying her official portrait with quiet satisfaction. The artist had captured her exactly as she was, the silver threading through her golden hair, the lines in her eyes that spoke of both sorrow and joy, the strength in her expression that came from surviving what would have destroyed weaker souls. "You are more beautiful now than the day we met," Thaddeus murmured, stepping behind her to wrap his arms around her waist. Their twin daughters, Grace and Victoria, barely 2 years old, played on the carpet nearby, their laughter filling the gallery that had housed centuries of Blackwood nobility. Almira leaned back against her husband, watching their daughters, and smiled. She had spent 45 years being told she'd missed her chance, that her life was over before it began. But her true life had only started when society declared it finished. And it was more magnificent than any fairy tale she'd ever dared to dream. The end. Did you enjoy the story? Do you have something insightful to share about the story? Please share in the comments section. Also, do not forget to like this video and subscribe to this channel. It will help others come across this channel faster, and they'll fall in love with these captivating Victorian-era romance stories, just as you did. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye for now.